Hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. This is Jeffrey Beston, Intuilab's Chief Marketing Officer, and it's my pleasure to spend the next hour introducing you to Intuiface. We're doing this for a couple of reasons. One, Intuiface is much easier than people assume it actually is. In light of what's possible, which I'll show you, people tend to assume, well, I'm not a developer, well, I'm not highly technical. Well, you'll see that's not true. Anybody can use this product. And I'll prove it. The second reason we're having this webinar is because of the way people tend to think about this space. For example, the most common search term in Google for the kind of thing we do is presentation software, which is fine, but connotes something different than what we do. It connotes a subset. When people think presentations, they think slides. They think bullet points on a slide, which you can do with Intuiface. But that is a minor subset of what is actually possible with Intuiface. You can build for any vertical. You can build for any audience. You can work with any content. This is not just a presentation tool. In fact, we call it an experience creation tool because your audience can experience anything you have in mind. Could be retail kiosk, curated art exhibit, real estate listings, you name it, it's possible with very simple building blocks. Now, what you see on screen is a video that I'm not going to play now because it's a screen share that's not going to work very well, but we're going to share this experience with you at the end of the webinar. You'll have it on your own machine. You can run it in Composer, and you can watch this video. You'll see a montage of experiences created by some of our customers. But if you look at the screenshots here, you'll notice there's no consistent look. Intuiface is not template-driven. You don't buy a real estate app from Intuilab. It's any design, any concept, any audience. So note the variety of layouts. We can also, by the way, work with multi-screen displays and small format displays. It's not your traditional landscape 1920 by 1080 full HD display. There's multiple ways you could format it, lay it out with any design possible. And it's a very important point that when you sit down with Intuiface, this is not about bullet points and title headings. Much, much more than that. And we'll spend the rest of this webinar discussing it. We're going to start by talking about Composer and Player. I want to make sure everyone on this call knows the difference. Intuiface Composer is the editor. That's the tool you use to create your interactive experiences. Intuiface Player is the runtime. That's the tool you use to run your Intuiface experiences. It is very possible that your organization will own only a small number of composers and a very large number of players. A simple example would be a design agency. You might have multiple projects, multiple clients, multiple experiences per client, but in-house you only have 2 or 3 composers. It's possible. There's no limit to the number of experiences you can create with Composer. There's no limit to the number of players you can use with Composer. There's no limits. But recognize the difference. Composer is the editor, Player is the runtime. And during this webinar, we'll spend all of our time in Composer because that's where all the magic happens. Player is just for deployment. Briefly, Composer runs on Windows 7 and Windows 8. Player runs on Windows 7, Windows 8, and the iPad. So there is a deployment option for Player that you don't have when you're building the experience. You build on Windows, you can deploy to Windows or the iPad. So that's Composer and Player. This whole webinar will be about Composer. There are 3 additions to Composer. If any of you have been to our website, you might have visited the pricing page at some point and noted 3 additions, Free, Pro, and Enterprise. I'm not going to go into the nuances here. I just want to make the point that everything you see today, you can do with the free edition. The free edition is free. It lasts forever. It doesn't time out. And everything you see me do, you can do as well. There are, of course, limitations. That's why we call it free. So, for example, there'll be a watermark in the experiences you create. You cannot use Player if you build an experience with the free edition of Composer. But in terms of the features available for creating and realizing your designs, everything you see that I do, you can do as well. So no worries. And since we're asked this often, let me just point out, you do not need a touch screen to work with Intuiface. You can imagine a lot of our prospects don't have a touchscreen when they first download Intuiface. You can think of a mouse as a finger. So as long as you have a mouse and a keyboard, you can use Composer, and you can practice building experiences. You'll also note that Player is embedded inside Composer. You'll see that in the editor, there's a Play button. That's Player. So you don't have to buy Player to test your work. You just need to purchase Player if you want to deploy it. For testing, use the embedded Player, plain and simple. So that's our background. Let's now talk about Composer itself. That's all preamble. Everything else is demonstration of the product. So let's go to the spaces and layers. Here we go. What you're looking at is Composer. I imagine a good percentage of you have already played with Composer a little bit. You've downloaded it. But in case some of you haven't, this is the editor. This is Composer. In the middle is what we call the scene. This is where you do your work. Like a PowerPoint, you always have the slide you're editing in the middle, and the same thing goes here. This is the space that you're currently editing. That space represents this scene represents whichever space I have selected in the upper left-hand corner. Those are my list of spaces. You can think of them as slides. The difference, though, is the order isn't as relevant as it might be in a slide presentation. Almost by definition, like a PowerPoint presentation, it's meant to be done sequentially. Whereas in Intuiface, your design determines the path a user takes, which may be very independent of the order of spaces in the upper left-hand corner. As a designer, it's important for me. I want to organize my work, and I want to make sure they're well-named, etc. But from a user's perspective, from your audience's perspective, that order may not be as relevant. But you can see this webinar experience is comprised of multiple spaces. Currently selected is this particular space, and you can see in the scene in the middle, there's the content of that scene. In the bottom left is the space content panel. That summarizes all the stuff in the scene I'm currently editing. Okay? You might notice there are layers here, back, middle, and front. That literally means, how do I want the depth of my assets, of my content to be organized? What do I want in front of other items? Having asset depth can be very important for your design. If everything is on the same level, it can be a very confusing layout as people start manipulating objects. So the advantage of these layers is it helps you create that depth and make it easier for your design to be understood. One last point here is the notion of a sequence. A sequence is a convenient tool for designers who wish to organize their spaces logically. The sequence itself is not a space. It's a group of spaces. Again, it doesn't really predetermine an order necessarily. It can just be used for your own design organization. And we use that here as well because it's easy to see where we are. Right now we're in the philosophy and concept sequence. We're on the first space. So that's your first introduction to Composer. You have the Spaces panel in the upper left, the content of the active space in the bottom left, and here in the middle is the content of the active space, the scene. Very nice, not very exciting. We haven't built anything yet. Let's start building something. So now I'm moving to the Assets and Collection space. It's important to understand a distinction between the notion of an asset and the notion of the content you're going to use. There's a lot of different types of content you can use in Intuiface. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, follow my mouse. We can work with images, videos, documents, web browsers. If you have a URL, you can open the website in our product. 2 text assets, flash animation, 3D models, audio, and Microsoft Deep Zoom images. All of these things can be added to any space and organized in any design you can conceive of. Any of them collectively, there's no template restrictions, as I mentioned. Any one of them can be placed here, and you don't have to do anything to make them interactive. So the first thing I'm going to do, I actually have on the side of my screen here, I'll bring it in, Windows Explorer. I have a whole bunch of images and content I'm going to use for this webinar. I'm just going to drag in the little Beetlejuice poster here. So here we have an image in my space. I can resize it. It's a what you see, what you get editor. I'm rotating this. I can manipulate this image, place it wherever I wish. So all I've done is I've added an image, and I'm going to push play. This puts me into play mode. As I mentioned, this is really just player. And using my fingers, I am now manipulating this image. I didn't have to tell it to be interactive. It just is. Anticipating some of your questions, what if I don't want people to rotate it? What if I don't want people to move it? That's where the properties come in. There's a long list of properties you can use to configure the look and reactivity of assets that you place into your experiences. We'll get there. But for now, notice I just drag it in and it works. And in the content library on the right, I can now see it. Here it is in my list. These are all of the items I'm using in my experience. It could be across multiple spaces. I might use the same image, for example, in multiple spaces. So here's my content library, and here's the Beetlejuice image. There's a lot of things that you can do with content in addition to simple design. I like this one other example. I lost Windows. Here's Windows Explorer. So I'm going to drag in another image. This time, it's actually a background image. It's formatted for a full HD display. It's a 1920 by 1080 image. One nice thing I can do is just right-click it and say Set as Background. So it automatically replaces the background. And this is brilliant because you don't have to worry about creating layers with backgrounds. No. There's an individual property called background. You can see it at the bottom of your screen right here. The background is set to an image, and it's this specific image. I can change that image. I can reset it back to the original. Very easy. I can even make my background a video or colors. So I have a lot of flexibility to modify and customize the background so every single pixel reflects my design. Nothing is forced. So that's an example of a single image and the use of these images to perhaps create a background. I'm going to add a few more images. So let me get them from Windows Explorer and drag them into my scene here. So now I have multiple images. I'll shrink those a bit, and then we can separate them. So you can see we now have 5 images. Not much of a design, but when we go in play mode, you'll see how amazing this actually is. I'm also going to add a book. So here's a PDF file. This is a PDF. Biography. Notice the Tim Burton theme, by the way. Tim Burton pictures, a Tim Burton biography, and a little demo reel about Tim Burton. We have a book, a movie, and 5 images. I'm pushing play. We have no concurrency issue in terms of touches. I can manipulate multiple images at the same time. I can manipulate the book and the image at the same time. I can turn the pages in the book. Static that, so I can change the pages of the book. Meanwhile, by the way, the movie could be running and I can manipulate the movie. I can take any supported assets, create any design I wish. They're all independently interactive, or I could use them at the same time. Of course, if you have a 22-inch display, you need to be mindful you can't have 10 hands touching it at the same time. It wouldn't be a very usable design. But in theory, you could have an enormous number of concurrent touches in your design. So here we have multiple images, a book, and a document. We've been talking about the assets. These are the assets. So for example, this image asset contains this particular poster. I can change the image in the asset. So there's a difference between the content and the asset. I can change the content inside the asset, which becomes very valuable as I advance my skills with Composer, because you can start changing content on the fly as a reaction to user input. You can make it much more dynamic by reacting to user input, changing the content on the fly. That's why the distinction between an asset and the content is so important. The content is in the content library. The asset is the container holding the content. Another very important concept is that of a collection. So let me make a little space here. Okay, we have the 5 images, which is an image wall. I mean, you can already, knowing what you know, build an image wall with Composer. Drag a bunch of images in, push play, you now have an image wall. Let's take a look at a collection. I'm going to add a collection from the toolbar to the left. This is going to be an asset grid. I added an empty asset grid. There's no content in it. In the lower left spaced content panel, I'm selecting all 5 images and dragging it into the asset grid. And look what happens. I no longer have 5 independent images. I have a single collection that enables me to, with a single swipe of my finger, browse all of the images at once. That's what we mean by a collection. It's that logical grouping of assets that enables me to interact with them as a whole. I can combine different asset types. It doesn't just have to be all images. I can combine multiple asset types. I can even put collections inside collections. Ultimately, this means it allows me to interact with a large number of assets and collections with a single finger. we have a large number of collections. I'm going to quickly change this from an asset grid to an asset flow. So an asset grid is rows and columns. An asset flow might be familiar to you from something like iTunes. If you're doing an album, taking a look at the albums. And I'm just going to push play. So the images are a little small, but I don't want to play with anything. I'm just going to use my finger and drag it to the left and then drag it to the right. So there I am. I have my ability to look at all of the images with a single swipe of my finger, in this case in what we call an asset flow. Very simple. And you'll notice I didn't have to design it and configure it. It just works. One other collection that's interesting for the moment is the slideshow collection. This is the Ken Burns effect. Anybody might be familiar with the Ken Burns effect, which is this slow pan, zoom, and then transition to a new image. What's nice about the slideshow effect is you can use it as an attract loop. One thing we're often asked is, well, what if I have a kiosk in a public place? I can't have that kiosk stuck in some random space that doesn't attract new visitors. We're going to discuss how you manage that environment a little later in the webinar, but one thing you could put on that attract space to generate interest and attention might be the slideshow collection, which can very simply add a few images, make it a slideshow collection, and it works. And you can configure it, etc. But a very simple method for creating something dynamic with a little bit of motion that catches attention, and very simple to build. You'll notice we will never, ever write code. You are not writing code. There's a couple other very interesting collections that are slightly different. All of the collections we've discussed now just sort of shows the content as it exists. We have two other collections that are slightly different but very interesting. The map and the timeline. Let's look at the map. So I'm adding a map to my space here. This is actually OpenStreetMaps. This is a live connection to the OpenStreetMap database. We can also work with Bing Maps. This is OpenStreetMaps, and I can double-click on this, and I can zoom in. In fact, to those who joined early, I told you I was in Rockport, so we can head on over to my hometown. Here we go, just north of Gloucester. There we go. So this is a live map, and by itself, this could be interesting. This could be in my experience, and I can let people browse the map. But we can do a lot more than that. It's still a collection. I can still add items to the map as I can add items to any collection. What's interesting here is that when you add items to a map, it inherits two new properties, and you can see it here on the bottom, latitude, longitude. So every item I add to the map collection is geolocated. It becomes a point of interest. And no matter what I do to the map, the point of interest is stuck to that latitude, longitude coordinate. The beauty of this is that you can put anything in the map as a point of interest. You could put a video, an image, a document, or, as we'll discuss in a few moments, you could put a button. And use the button to play a video, to show images, to display a collection in reaction to the interaction of a user. So you can make your map not just interactive as a map, but also reveal content relevant to points of interest. It's very powerful. Very powerful way to leverage the map to create an engaging experience that's relevant to something that's geolocated. And see how easy that was. I just dragged it in, gave it a latitude, longitude, and we're done. The other really cool collection is the timeline collection. The main difference is the map collection, that's geolocated, it's latitude, longitude. The timeline collection is a date. So you can assign any kind of asset to a date, a day, a month, a year, swipe left and right to go through history, and that can all be interactive. And you can leverage that for who knows what. If this is a corporate pitch, you can do the history of the company and use the timeline to swipe through different product releases and new hires and events in the history of the company, and you can touch them and run videos. It'll be highly dynamic, and you can create it in seconds. So that's assets and collections. And as I'll continue to point out, you already know enough to make really cool stuff with Intuiface. It's that simple. But we do get asked a lot about configuration of the content I put inside my design. How can I constrain it or make it operate in certain ways? And that's where properties come in. Properties allow me to manipulate the content and configure it in ways that constrains the design and makes it conform closer to what I envisioned. A simple example would be the document asset, you'll recall this from earlier. This is a PDF, and you'll recall that I was swiping left and right. Well, we actually have more than one book format. In fact, one is called a book, and you can see me grab it in the bottom left here in Composer. Rather than that horizontal scroll that you saw, I can just make it a book. Now we have pages, pages that can be turned. You can see the little dog ear of the page in the upper right corner. When I play this, I'll be able to turn the pages. And we'll do that in a moment. Let's also work with a collection. So I'm going to grab some images from Windows Explorer off the side of the screen, drag it into my experience, and just create a collection. I don't want a bunch of independent images. I want a collection. Here's the asset grid you've come to know and love. I'm going to change this to a carousel, which always looks great. I love carousels. Carousels present themselves very well. So here's a carousel. All of the images I dragged in are now oriented as a carousel, which you can imagine I can spin. But if you look at the bottom of Composer, we have a few exposed properties here, such as view angle. If I drag it down, the view angle gets steeper. If I reduce the size of the view angle, it gets shallower. With the diameter property, I can make the spacing wider or smaller. I can change the width and height of the items inside the carousel. So there's some basic things I can choose to do to configure this collection. If I click this button, there's a long list of things I can do to configure this collection. Rather than going through each one, let me point out a really interesting option, which is the ability to cause items in the collection to pop out, to create a copy that I can independently interact with. Tap item to open, click, drag and drop item to open, click. So by just clicking those buttons and pushing play, not only do I now have a book whose pages I can turn. Here's the book. I'm dragging the page. See that? So I can turn the pages in my book. With the carousel, if I use my finger, I'm spinning through the carousel. And because I just made those two little check marks, if I touch Beetlejuice, I get a copy. Remember what I said earlier. I can have any asset type inside a collection. Could be an image, a video, document. Could be other collections. Could be a map. You can choose to have them interactive inside the collection. I could choose that I don't want the video in the carousel to pop out. I just want to play the video while it's in the carousel. I can do that. Or I can just click that little checkbox and now I can pop out the video and play it independently. You could even use this kind of effect as a table of contents. You can imagine that you might have multiple sections in your interactive experience, and you use a collection like the carousel to indicate the different chapters, capturing the touch event, as I'll show you, using what we call triggers and actions, capturing the touch event and navigating to the right part of the experience. Assets, collections, properties. Again, imagine what you can create with just this little bit of knowledge and a great design. Right? We can't help you have a good design. If you have a great design, great content, and these small number of tools, it can be very effective. Okay. One other thing about properties, just because it's really cool, we get asked this a lot, and that's about drawing tools. We're often asked, well, can I draw on the screen? Is it possible to draw on the screen? If all I do is select all of the images inside my carousel in the bottom left here, open up the Properties panel, and in the Tools section, turn on the Drawing Tools. Each image now has a drawing tool. We default to a gray color. I'm going to make this red, so let's make red an option. I'll now have 3 colors to choose from, 2 pen widths to choose from. It's all configurable, but all I've done is I've turned on the Drawing Tool and added the red color. Push and play. We're back to the book again. We're back to the carousel again. If I pop out a copy of the image, not only do I have the image, I have a little tool on the left of the item that allows me to draw on it. 2 clicks, and now you're drawing on your screen. Now you have a business meeting. Now you have a trade show demonstration. Now you have some interactive exhibit at a museum. Very simple.
Jeff, while we are on the properties, I guess we can have a short parenthesis about the transparency and effects we can add on assets or collections. That's a question we had from Jordan. So could you please show the transparency on the carousel, maybe, and showing maybe some kind of grayscale? So let's have a look at this. So if you go into visibility and effects, you will see the opacity, which is set to 1 by default. You can just reduce this one to get some half transparent object. So this works on any assets or any collections. And let's take the example of the grayscale, for example. If you put the grayscale to 100, you get everything black and white. And so the new question is, can you trigger an effect like blur with an action? Yes, definitely. But since we haven't talked about triggers and actions for the moment, we'll see that in the next chapter.
We have an eager audience member. Yes, in fact, it's now time for us to talk about triggers and actions. We've talked about assets and collections, the properties of assets and collections. Now we're going to talk about triggers and actions. Triggers and actions, that's cause and effect. When X happens, then do Y. This is a very powerful extension of Intuiface because it allows you to add layers and layers of dynamic, responsive content to your experiences. This is no longer just images in a carousel. This is reacting to user input to cause very specific things to happen. And you never write code. The easiest way to illustrate this is to use a button. Because everybody knows a button is meant to be used to cause something to happen. A button exists to cause something to happen. So we have a very special notion of a button. In fact, there's two kinds of buttons. There's a simple button, which you see here, which is colors and some text. We also have an image button, which looks like the image. It doesn't have to look like a button, and we'll see that a little later in the webinar. Let's stick with the simple button. Here's a button. I need to tell my experience what to do if somebody touches that button, which brings us to the Triggers and Actions panel on the bottom right side of Composer. I'm going to open it up by clicking this row. Let me explain what you're seeing here. When the button is released, then do something. Now, I have multiple things I can choose even for the button. You'll notice, for example, I could say when the button is pressed. We default to is released because we want to give the user an opportunity to change their mind. If we triggered on is pressed, then the moment their finger touched the button, that would set off the action. We don't want that to happen. We want it so that if you touch the button and then drag your finger off, you've changed your mind. This is not unusual. That's how the web works. If you left-click a link, but you drag your mouse off the link before you let go, it doesn't follow the link. That's because it's going on release, not on press. So when the button is released, then what? There's a long list of possible actions, one of which is navigation. I want to go someplace else in my experience. So when the button is released, then space-to-space navigation, go to space, properties, the previous space. I want to arrange it so that when somebody pushes this button, it goes back to the property space. Play. So here's my experience. Here's the button. 1, 2, 3, touch. And now I'm back on the property space. Very simple. And that's the point. It's so simple. But you can navigate anywhere in your experience, right? It doesn't have to be the one previous or the one next. It could be anywhere in your experience. I'm going to do one other thing that you can't appreciate fully, but I'm going to stick my finger on the bottom right corner of my touch screen and drag it left. 1, 2, 3, drag to the left. Gestures are triggers too. So it's not just touching something specifically, but it could just be doing something on the screen. You can actually see it. If I go to the properties space, you can see that there's detect a gesture triggers. One of them is when the space detects which gesture? A swipe left. When the space detects a swipe left gesture, then space-to-space navigation next. Or previous, right? And that's relative to the spaces panel. That's where the order is relevant if you just want to use next or previous. But I could have chosen go to space. Every asset, every collection, every control has a long list of triggers and actions. There's about 200 triggers in Intuiface, 200 plus actions in Intuiface. For example, a video. There's an action which is play video, which makes no sense at all for an image, so there's no such thing as play image. But that does have relevance for video. And videos have fast forward, rewind, go to a certain timestamp. autoplay, all of these different things you can configure for the video. And that goes for all collections and all assets, a long list of triggers, a long list of actions, which can make it very dynamic, which I hope is clear. Let me illustrate with another example. I'm going to add a timer to this space. This goes back to the question, if this is an unattended experience, how do I make sure that it doesn't get stuck on some irrelevant space, thereby failing to attract new people? How do I make that work? You use an inactivity timer. You tell Intuiface, hey, if a certain amount of time passes and nothing has happened on screen, do something. So when an inactivity timer on this space has been inactive for 3 seconds, then navigate. In this case, we can navigate to the video tour. Go to the space, video tour. We consider the video tour maybe our attract space. That's the space we want playing in the lobby when nobody's using the experience. And we've arranged it so that if this particular space, the triggers and action space, is untouched for 3 seconds, then it will automatically navigate to the introduction space. So let's give it a shot. I just push play. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. There you go. And we just automatically navigated to the attract loop. Now, of course, in reality, you're not setting this to 3 seconds. Even if somebody is there, they may not interact with it for 30 seconds or a minute, what have you, depending on the content. So you want to set a sensible amount of time. But now you know how to set up a kiosk in an unattended area and ensure that it always resets itself to the space you designed to attract attention. So we've talked about the use of buttons, the use of triggers and actions in general, the way timers can facilitate your use in an unattended context. There's one other thing I wanted to show you because it's a really cool feature we added recently, which is animation. And animation is really just, quote unquote, another action. To illustrate it, because it takes a little bit longer, and this is an introductory discussion, and I don't want to spend too much time on any one point. I'm going to go into the Design Accelerators panel, which we'll discuss in the next chapter. Give me a minute. I'm going to drag in a finger with built-in animation. And actually, we'll add a button here so you get to appreciate the effect. And I'm going to drag the button to the bottom layer so that the hand is on top. See that? My use of layers. So now I have a hand on top of a button. If I go into play mode, this button breathes. That's what we mean by animation, is it gradually changes states. Could be position, could be color, could be location, could be size, could be whatever. So it's automatically animating itself. In this case, it's letting somebody know, hey, you can touch this button. The animation is achieved through the creation of an action dedicated to animation. Now here it is. Again, it's an introductory webinar. We don't have the time to go through the details, but let me just point out that the scale could have been done immediately. Just get 1.5 times bigger. We could have done that, but we're saying no, animate that and reverse it. That's what's happening on the right here. Animate the scale up, then reverse it and repeat. That's what we've animated here on the right. I can actually add other actions. I can have multiple things animating at the same time and then use this little timeline in the upper right where my mouse is to choreograph the timing and the overlap of those events. I don't have to animate just one thing. I can animate multiple things and then choreograph it. Another very powerful feature that we've introduced fairly recently. We're very proud of it and we want people to use it, and it's just another action. In this case, it was just based on a timer. Here's the trigger for the animation. The trigger was a timer has elapsed. That triggered the animation for the finger. I think this audience is now a trigger and action expert. And between assets, collections, properties, triggers, and actions, I am sure you can create amazing, amazing experiences already. Much more than bullets on a slide. Way more than bullets on a slide. Design accelerators. That's what I was showing you very briefly on the right side of Composer. What we've done is we, Intuilab, have pre-created assets, images, videos, buttons, menus, things that are pre-created with a little bit of flair so you can accelerate your creation of an experience. So for example, we have background images, background videos that you can just add in immediately. You saw way at the bottom of the list, I had the touch gestures that I could drag in so I can indicate what needs to be done by the user. You can use this little slider in the upper left if you want to increase or decrease the size, get a better understanding of what's available. Officially, when you install Composer, we pre-install a subset of the available design accelerators. We call them bundles. So we install, about 4 or 5 bundles. I think there's about 20 bundles. To see the others, you click this little rainbow-colored cloud. When I click that cloud, you see all of the design accelerator bundles, and they exist so that I can download them. Okay? One other example of a design accelerator, just to illustrate some of the other principles we've discussed, would be some of these buttons. So let me grab, let's see, here's previous bold.
Quick word about the design accelerators, because I have a very nice question about those ones. Can I export my assets to design accelerators? Very soon, in the next release, the big one we will have in July, you will be able to create your own design accelerators directly from Composer. So that's one of the nice enhancements we'll have in the July version.
Yeah, this will be great. So your lead designers could pre-create content that then could be used and distributed amongst multiple experience creators. It would be a nice advantage, and yes, that'll be in the next version. Should be middle of next month. I have added a button from the design accelerators that exists to move the experience to the previous space. You'll notice it's prepped with the trigger and action pair. It's pre-built. So there's the trigger and the action. When the button is pressed and released, go to the previous space. This is actually an image button. I just wanted to point this out. This is not a simple button. It's an image button, which means the pressed and release states look different. That's visual feedback to your audience to know they pushed the button. So the press state and the release states look different. I could still do this as a simple button. I can change it to a simple button. It's just some color and some text. You can do that. The nice thing about the image button, obviously, is that from a design perspective, is enormously more flexibility if you can do that with an image button. And a little tip, use invisible buttons, because that's a great way to create image maps. If you have some really complex graphic that your company uses, for example, and that's your table of contents, just overlay it with invisible buttons, buttons that you can't see but that are there, and now you're triggering off your graphic. Very simple concept, very powerful. All of a sudden, this amazing graphic your company spent weeks building and confusing everybody is now interactive. And you can use it to steer that audience to relevant parts of your experience. Final chapter, interface assets and binding. This is another webinar, interface assets and binding. That's how powerful this is. We just wanted to introduce you to the concepts, you're aware of its existence, and then start thinking about how you might take advantage of it. Interface assets enable Intuiface experiences to interact with external data or business logic, or devices. External data, business logic, and devices. In a way, you could think of this as meaning that it eliminates your need to work with static environments and now work in dynamic environments. And to illustrate my point, think of a retail kiosk. It's a pretty bad idea for a retail kiosk in a public place to contain static data because it will very quickly be out of date. Maybe the prices have changed. Maybe it's no longer in stock. Maybe the different colors are no longer available. Maybe the sizes have changed. Who knows? You really need a dynamic connection with, in this case, an ERP application, to constantly ensure that I'm showing the latest and greatest information. That's what interface assets can do for you. You can access dynamic data, dynamic business logic. We're often asked, does Intuiface have a search function? No, and we will never have a search function. Why? Because there's an infinite number of search functions no matter what we build won't work for you. You build a search function and use an interface to communicate with it. You bridge the user experience you create with Intuiface with the logic you create offline. Could be JavaScript, could be .NET, could be REST-based. There are different mediums you can use to create the business logic, to facilitate communication. You can use all of those things to ensure you have a dynamic experience, not a static. Here's another example. We pre-install some interfaces for you. Chronometer, clock, and countdown. There's some logic for you that you can incorporate in your experience. One I'll use is the weather. I'm going to add to my experience the default design we create for the weather interface asset. There's a service somewhere on the web that if you ask it a question about a city, it's going to send you back information about the weather. This is not our service. It's some public service. And we created an interface that ships with Intuiface that knows how to talk to that service. And it's querying that service for the latest weather information. It defaults to London, but if I select the interface asset and I change in the properties panel below, London to Boston, now I'm getting the weather in Boston. This is live. This is not in my machine. Let me point something very important out. You do not have to use that design. You do not have to use that design. We created that design sort of like a design accelerator, so you had something you can use on day one. In reality, you can create any design you want. The information coming through the Intuiface is simply bound to your design, which is what we mean by binding. You can bind information either coming from outside through an interface or actually relative to another item in your experience. You can bind that property information or that content to other items. And to illustrate that, let's take a look at this logo in the upper right-hand corner. If I select this Intuiface logo in the upper right, you'll notice its X and Y property at the bottom are orange. That means that the X and Y property is not determined here. It's actually bound to something else, and that something else determines the X and Y coordinates. To prove that, I can tell you it's bound to this logo on the introduction space. Notice it's not orange. If I drag this logo down here and go back to Interface Assets and Bindings, the logo's now down there. Why? Because it's bound to the logo on the first space. Bindings are crazy powerful. And like I said, between interface assets and binding, we could spend a whole other hour. But I at least wanted you to be familiar with the concept of what an interface asset does, that we have a bunch of pre-existing interface assets you can use with any edition, including the free edition. Here's getting a Twitter feed. Here's an RSS feed. Here's working with the Philips Hue, working with Leap Motion, working with Connect. Email. There's a ton of interfaces we've pre-built to extend the capability of your product, of your experience, I should say. And you can create your own. Now, that's one departure in terms of editions. If you want to create your own interfaces, which you can, it's all documented online, you need the Enterprise Edition. But if you want to use the pre-built ones, be our guest. Even with the free edition, you can use them.
Jeff, we have a question about the interface asset and actually the weather widget that you just showed.
Go ahead.
So the question is, are there clear documentation on how to customize the look of the weather widget? So yes and no, because you can do whatever you want. The idea is here when Jeff instantiated this weather asset, it created in the space content on the bottom left corner a group with lots of default assets, some rectangle shapes, some text, some images, etc. Where you see those little objects on the right side, it means that some property is bound to the interface asset which is behind, to the data which comes from the web service. So basically, you can just copy and paste any of those items here and put them outside of the group, reorganize them the way you want, change the font of the text, the color of the text, whatever you want. As soon as you have the interface asset, which is the model and the data behind, you can create any look you want and bind your assets to this data. And yes, we have documentation about that. We'll talk about those references in the conclusion of the presentation.
Thank you, Seb. So mindful of time, let's talk about what you do with your experience when you're finished. You've built your experience. You're in love with it. You want to share it. You want to share it with colleagues. You want to give it to a client, what have you. Step number one, you publish. We can publish to one of 3 public cloud storage providers. We can publish experiences to Amazon S3, Box or Dropbox. It could be your account. It could be your corporate account. It doesn't matter. You just need, in Management Console, which you'll see in a moment, you need to configure, essentially give us permission to publish to those accounts. You do that from the File menu. File, publish. And Composer will automatically push it to the cloud storage provider you've specified. Once it's published, you can share it. Okay? Now, I'm not going to publish my changes here. I'm just going to select the Manage This Experience in the Cloud. What I'm saying is, please open Management Console and open the information panel about this specific experience. I've just clicked it, and let me drag the browser window here. So here's Management Console. Here is the introductory panel about the experience we've been working on. A little bit of information about the last time I updated, how big it is, where it's published. I can add a description, and I can share it. So I can list any email addresses I want, click Share, and it's shared. If the email address is associated with an existing Intuiface account, they receive an email saying, Jeff has shared an experience with you, click here to open it. If the email address is not associated with an Intuiface account, then the email they get says, somebody shared an experience with you, click this button to create an Intuiface account. So one way or the other, you can share with anybody. And the beauty is, because you've published it to the cloud, when the people you've shared it with open up Composer or Player, it can automatically download because it's publicly accessible. Makes it much easier to share your work with colleagues and with clients. Publishing and sharing is available to all editions of Composer. If you have at least one Enterprise Edition license of Composer, there's one other thing you can do in Management Console, and that's deploy to remote PCs without leaving your desk. These three devices in the bottom of my screen, this device is actually my PC. I have Player running on my PC. These players are associated with my Intuiface account. I have permission to deploy to them, so I see them. And if I wanted to deploy today's webinar experience to either of these PCs, I just click and drag this experience down. And when I drop it, I'm saying, copy it here and go run it. You can imagine for large, geographically distributed deployments, this is a significant time saver. You don't have to leave your desk. If you have one kiosk and it's in the next room, maybe it's not that interesting. If you have 100 kiosks in different offices around the world, there's no comparison. This is a huge time saver. The ability to deploy is unique to those with at least one Enterprise Edition version of Composer. The ability to publish and share, any edition can do that. So that's Management Console. Believe it or not, we've talked about everything. All the building blocks. Assets and collections. We've discussed how to manipulate properties to configure their look and feel. How to work with triggers and actions. How to leverage design accelerators. Using interface assets and binding to extend your ability to work with dynamic information, dynamic business logic, and even devices like Microsoft Connect, the Philips Hue, any kind of connected object. I really have to believe that between this webinar and a little bit of work, you're going to be creating amazing things very shortly. We recognize that despite this webinar and all your good intentions, you're not going to become an expert in 2 minutes. So we've made a lot of information available online to help accelerate the learning process. If you see the image at the bottom of my screen here, on our website under Learn, there's an option called Teach Yourself. Click that link. You'll see a reference to online documentation. There's more than 100 articles online. But everything you ever wanted to know about Intuiface. How to use an image asset, how to use the web browser asset, work with 3D models, configure collections, build interfaces, use triggers, you name it, it's there. Free for everybody to use. Discussion forums. Submit questions online. If you have the free edition, you get community response. If you have Pro and Enterprise edition, you get responses from our own technical support engineers. Search it, because there's a good chance that if you have a question, somebody else already asked it and it was answered. Instructional videos. We have about 10 videos online that you'll get to hear more of me yapping as I show you how to do very specific things with the product. A step-by-step tutorial. That's a big one for me because it forces you to use the product. It's one thing to read, it's another thing to do. The tutorial, which works with Tim Burton content, kind of forces you to create an experience. Everything we've discussed is addressed in the tutorial, and by the time you're done, I really think you'll be a superhero. We do have a lot of business samples and presentations you can download. In fact, if I open up the Experiences panel inside Composer, This is the thing you see when you start Composer. The new tab is if I want to create a new experience, and there's some templates that I can use optionally to do that. My experiences, this is where the work that I've created or the work shared with me shows up. And then samples, which are experiences Intuilab created to illustrate how you can use Intuiface successfully. You can both play these things and you can see how we built them. So you have both. And then finally, we also have additional videos online that might help you be more adept at using Intuiface. I really hope this webinar has helped you appreciate how simple it is to create seemingly non-trivial experiences. The old Minority Report example that everybody uses, Intuiface has been around since 2009. And you can create for any vertical, for any audience, with any content and any design, anything with Intuiface. What it does is reduces implementation time. You spend much less time on implementation, which means you have much more time on ideation and design. You can come up with much better content, much better concept, much better design, and whip off the implementation in no time at all. Which is the irony. The better you get Intuiface, the less you use it because it's so easy to use. So be careful about your design. You can make ugly designs with Intuiface that were amazingly interactive. But that's the beauty, is to reduce implementation to focus on design. Seb, was there a question?
Actually, yeah, I got 4 or 5 questions at the same time.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, already answered 2 or 3 of them directly in the chat. A big one, which is quite important. How do you deploy to iPads? Well, that's very easy, actually, as you have 2 different options. The first one is using the publish and share that Jeff just showed. So basically, in Composer, you do a file publish, you log in on your iPad using Interface Player for iPad that you install from the App Store with the same account, and you will see your experience. You just have to click download. That's it. If you want to download it on an iPad with another account, just publish, share it with this account, and then log in with the second account on the iPad and hit download. That's very easy. The other solution is if you're just doing work in progress, you just want to test your work on the iPad. You can directly create a local connection between the iPad and Composer. So in Composer, you hit play, you go into play mode. On your iPad, you hit the preview tab and you enter the name of your PC. So the iPad and the Composer has to be on the same network. And then you can just download it locally. So that's a very fast way of testing an app on the iPad. Another question, is it possible to use a live input video? Yes, actually, if you go into the knowledge base, I will put the link in the chat in a few minutes. Look for the video article, you will see that we handle a few live video protocols, so you can use them using the video asset. And yes, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar, and we are also going to share this experience that Jeff just built live in front of you to every participant.
Anything else coming in?
I guess I'm done with the questions.
I certainly encourage everyone, if you haven't downloaded the free edition, to please do so. You can be using the product 2 minutes after this webinar is over. Please take advantage of the online documentation. You'll be impressed. Please use the discussion forums. They're very active, and search them to get the answers you need regardless of what you have in mind. And, of course, you can always contact us offline. We're obviously biased. We think our product is pretty wonderful, and we want you to think the same thing. So please use it, beat it up, see what you can build with it, and impress us. I would love for some of our customers to share their experiences. I love seeing what can be created. It's so varied that sometimes I don't even recognize my own product, which I love it when I don't recognize my own product's work. So that'd be really exciting if you'd like to show off. Any more questions in the chat?
Yes, one about the guidelines for creating presentations, and here is the link on the knowledge base where you will find some answers, some first answers. Can I send you any link to samples that colleges or universities have done? Actually, I cannot. Jeff, I don't know if you have some links about those ones.
Well, the problem is, this reminds me of another question we sometimes get, which is, can you recommend a design agency that has Intuiface skills? And the answer is maybe. The problem is, a lot of the work built by agencies and even by universities is proprietary. They don't want us to have it. We're not allowed to have it. We can't even see it. So the problem is we have a lot of customers and we can't actually tell you if they're any good at the product, right? We can't see the work. And universities are the same thing. We have a lot of university customers. I'll name drop. We mentioned some on the web, but Harvard's a customer. University of Virginia. There's a lot of customers that use it, but we're not allowed to publish it. We're not allowed to distribute it. There's a lot of intellectual property that cannot get off the campus. So I'm trying to think if we have an example. I can't think of one. What I would ask is, what do you envision would be in it? And then we can discuss whether or not it's possible. My argument would be that it probably is possible and maybe even done. But sharing it, that's one reason why we build a lot of samples, is because somewhat may be unique to our business. The majority of our customers can't share their own work. On occasion it happens. What we do, sometimes we can see it internally, but we can't share it with you. We don't have the rights. So sometimes we see cool stuff we can't share with you. You get the point. So that can be a challenge. But let us know what you envision, and we can talk to you about whether or not it's possible. There's a lot more to Intuiface than we've discussed on this call. So there's even more that you can do.
Actually, two more questions. First one, how do you share iPad experiences using the Pro version? That's exactly what I said a few minutes ago. So just to publish from the composer, as we are going to do with this experience, which has been designed for a full HD screen, and in Management Console, to enter the email of the account with which you want to share your experience, log in with this account on the iPad, you will see it available, and you click on download, and that's it. The second question, which is, can I create a multi-display presentation? I would like to drag a video between 4 monitors, 4 machines, for example. Is it possible? So, can I create a multi-display presentation? Yes. Using 4 machines? No. Basically, we would use one machine with several graphic cards, and you will create a large experience. If you can open the project settings menu on your machine, it will help me to explain that. Okay, here is the size of the presentation. Basically, on an iPad, you would see 1024 by 768 for the old ones, or twice this size for the Retina one. Here is the Full HD resolution. If you have 4 screens, just input 4 times 1920 per 1080, and you get a very large display that you can use on a multi-touch large wall. I guess you can see one of those on the 3M booth in a show which is occurring right this week. Jeff, I don't know if you have the date in mind.
It's Infocom, but I think the show's over. Oops,
sorry for that. But yeah, basically they use Intuiface on at least 3 screens, maybe 6.
It was 6.
Okay.
It was 2 by 3. It was 2 rows of 3. We also, not only can we run on a multi-display wall, we can actually have experiences communicate with each other. So actions can be in the same experience or can be remote. So you can't have the same video jumping from experience to experience, but you could have the same video represented in multiple, and if you play it in one, it plays in the others. When this video plays, then play those videos as well. You can communicate actions to remote experiences, coordinating their performance, and they could be in the same room, they could be in different rooms. So not exactly what was asked. If I have a single experience on a multi-display wall, I can drag that video all over the place. If I have multiple experiences on multiple PCs, they can communicate through actions, and that can result in mirroring, among a million other things you could do that could result in some mirroring. And I hear you answering another question. My keyboard.
Yeah, actually, sorry for that. I go on mute again.
That's the challenge of any introductory webinar, of course, is that it's probably raising a lot of other questions. I mean, my main goal, I guess, for this webinar is to encourage you to try it. It's not nearly as hard as you might have thought. If you know how to use PowerPoint, you can use Intuiface. Period. That's the hurdle. And this is out of complete respect for Microsoft. That's a compliment. It's easy to use. PowerPoint is easy to use, and if you can use PowerPoint, you can use Intuiface. By now, I think I hope I have a room of converts, but that's the idea. I know we've run over time. I don't mind sticking around for other questions, Seb. Are there any others?
Actually, those are quite specific questions, case by case. So more generally, I would say, well, first, thank you for all the questions you had, and thank you for some of the great feedback I could read, especially from one guy working for the Microsoft Studios who is here with us, a great Intuiface user, definitely. By the way, if you have any more questions, please go to support.intulab.com. We have a whole team which will be able to answer you to all the different questions you may have, to all the different issues you may have. We'd be glad to help. And we also have the ideas.intulab.com, which allow you to propose new ideas, new enhancements for the product. So we keep hearing our users to make a better product.
Seb, thank you very much for your assistance. Everyone that's still on this meeting, thank you very much for giving us an hour of your time. I hope it was instructive. Please stay in touch, and I wish you great success with Intuiface. Thank you again.